just now. That's like become one of my favorite songs that we sing here now. So I was making a quick request of the band that when we get ready to close out here in a little bit, we may do that again. That's just the words of that are just powerful. So this morning we'll start the way we've been starting the last few weeks, and we're going to take a look at some messy pictures if everybody's up for that. And so here's one. This is what a mom discovered when she entered her son's room. And I love it because it looks kind of like a paper plate, ice cream container, Jenga game kind of thing. Have you guys played Jenga? You're supposed to pull one piece, it's supposed to stay together. And here's the thing that I thought was really awesome. This picture came from Sonny Krause, so we're like exposing everybody's pictures, so this is awesome. But what I loved most about this, Sonny, was the fact that your caption was nothing other than a sigh. It was just like that's, which is awesome. So I love that. How about this one? How can you not love that mess? Right? That's awesome. That's awesome. Heather Benson sent that in with Brylan, and she said, "This is my beautiful mess." The thing I loved about this picture personally is the fact that Brylan is a blur. And it's kind of like she's bolting, like, I don't know who did this, but it wasn't me. Which is awesome. I love that. Let me show you one more. Joanne Traeger shared a couple of her most favorite messes with us. And I know, is that like let's just pray and thank Jesus and go home, because that's awesome. That's good stuff right there. So thank you guys so much for sending us your messes. So this morning, we're going to wrap up our series addressing the mess, and then next week we're going to start a new 3-part series in the book of Philemon, or some of you call it Philemon. I like Philemon because it sounds like we're from the islands, man. Just Philemon, but that's not where we're from. But that's going to be cool. Mike is going to kick off that series next week, so you want to make sure you're here for that. By the way, if you're new to church or you've got friends that don't come to church, like the beginning of a series, sometimes it's a great opportunity. Kind of say, hey, check it out, we're starting something new. So an opportunity maybe invite somebody. Today, let's start by asking you a question. Have you ever made a mess messier? Have you ever, in the process of cleaning up a mess, it got worse? Yeah, everybody's like, there's stories, right? I'll share with you a story that came to mind when I was thinking about this question. Several years ago, we had the blessing and the opportunity to help Scott and Liz Breckley build a home several years ago. I know nothing about construction. What I learned through that was I learned a lot of what not to do, trying to help them. And so one of the things I learned not to do in their construction phase was the spray foam insulation. Y'all know that stuff? It's really good stuff. It works really well. And I can remember vividly because I remember the North Carolina blue wall that I was working in, which is their youngest son, Brian. That was his room. And they were sealing up around the windows. They had painted, but you didn't have the casing on or something yet. They were doing it right, and they were going to insulate around it. Well, I had never used that stuff before. And so and I love Scott and Liz to death. They were like, hey, let's give him something he can't screw up too bad. But I can screw up everything. And so I got it. I remember going up in the room, and I had this little tube. And I think Brian or Greg, somebody said, hey, take some paper towels with you because you'll probably need that. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a good thing. There was no carpet on the floor, so that's good. This story is going to get weird. But I'm spraying this stuff in, and when it goes in, it doesn't fill up the space. I thought it was supposed to. I didn't realize it expands. I just thought, well, this isn't getting it done. So I just kept, and I was spraying it in, and all of a sudden the stuff just starts oozing out of it, big oozing. And I'm like, oh, and I'm grabbing paper towels, and I'm wiping the paper towel, and that's working, but it keeps growing. And I'm like, I'm out of paper towels, so I'm taking my hand, and I'm like, yeah, I didn't know that. Where were you people? I didn't know where it was. So I'm wiping it on my pants because they were old scrubbies. It was all good. So I'm wiping it, and we finally got it under control. I was like, okay, we're good. That's fine. So then, it was late. It's time to leave, and I kind of washed off. That stuff does not come off your hands. And I'm not I can say this because my wife isn't in here to say otherwise, so I get to say whatever I want. I'm not a super neat freak. She would argue otherwise. Oh, my children! Christmas is coming, y'all. So anyway, so I could not get that stuff off my hands. It was the worst. And so we went to bed that night, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I kid you not, I could feel the sheets and stuff rubbing against that nasty, and the only place open at 2 o'clock in the morning to clean your hands is Walmart. And so we went. I'm like, well, let's go to Walmart. I've got to get this off my hands. And so we did. And so I bought every possible concoction you could get to get stuff off your hands, including steel wool. Oh. And so, but I'm so like upset about this is I'm going to do the cleaning in the bathroom at Walmart and not leave till it's off because I'm not going home like this anymore. So I'm in the bathroom and I've got all this product, and I'm just like, and I'm in there, and this guy walks in, and he just looks at me, and I just kind of look over my shoulder, and I think he thought I was scrubbing my fingerprints off, because something bad was going to happen, and I was going to be the one doing it, and that wasn't it. I was trying to explain to him, but it's one of those things where it started out as a mess, and it just got messier. And I think, all of you guys were nodding your head, and you're kind of like, hey, I've been in those situations where the mess got messier. And they're pretty funny, when we're talking about spray foam insulation. It becomes a little dicey when we're talking about making like a marriage mess messier, or we're talking about making a financial mess messier, or an academic mess messier, or a relationship mess messier. Because when we start doing that, they just get messier. That's it. Those kinds of messes aren't funny anymore. They're just messy, and they get messier. And so today, I want us to talk about the fact that every mess that we find ourselves in, every mess that we make, they all come with some bad options. Every mess comes with some bad options, right? Think about it. Borrow more. Lie bigger. Hide. Blame someone or something else. Destroy the evidence, right? All of these options just make our messes messier. So for the next few minutes, I want us to talk about ways to avoid messier, if we can. Because here's the thing I've learned, and I think most of you guys have been around long enough to know, sometimes it's hard or almost impossible to avoid a mess, but there are some things we can do to help us keep from making the mess messier. And I want us to talk about that a little bit. So to help us understand that, I want us to look at an incredible story in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel. So if you have a Bible or Bible app, we'll have some of the verses up here, but if you want to kind of follow along, 1 Samuel chapter 24 is where we'll be. And so for some of you that grew up in church, you may like thumb there or click over there, and all of a sudden you're going to see a heading of the story, and you're going to know how this story goes and how it ends. I'm just going to ask you to just like pull out of that for a second and just track with us a little bit. I know you want to get right to the end of the story. You know how this gets wrapped up. Try to avoid that if you can, if you're familiar with this story a little bit. This story actually, it takes place in about 1000 BC. It involves David, before David was a king. So if you don't know a little bit or know a lot about David, let me just kind of fill in the blanks a little bit, catch up a little bit before we jump in. So David was anointed a king when he was still a boy. We don't know exactly how old he was. A lot of people think he was somewhere between 12 and 13 years old, possibly, maybe younger, that he was anointed king of Israel. If you know the story, the prophet Samuel came to David's father Jesse and said, hey, God sent me here to anoint a new king of Israel, and one of your boys, one of your sons is going to be that king. And if you remember the story, Samuel thought, well, it must be that guy, he's the tall, good-looking guy or whatever, and it wasn't him. And they kind of worked their way down, and finally Samuel asked Jesse, like, hey, it was none of these guys, do you have another son? And Jesse's like, yeah, there's the squirt in the back watching the sheep. He was like, well, yeah, it must be him. And so Samuel anoints David as king. Anyone know the problem with that at all? You guys it's just us. I'm sorry? He was just a kid, and they already had a king. They already had a king, right? I heard it. Somebody said Saul. Yeah. So that was a little bit of a problem. They already had a king whose name was Saul. Most of you, if you didn't grow up in church, you've probably at least heard of David's famous story, right? David and Goliath, right? So that story happened before he was king. He was still a kid. His dad sent him to check on his brothers who were battling the Philistines. They were kind of shaking in their boots on the other side of the valley. They didn't want to deal with this giant named Goliath that kept coming out every day, kind of egging him on and kind of taunting him a little bit. David shows up to give food to his brothers and says, hey, what's going on? They're like, well, we're really not moving forward. We got a pretty big problem. And David's like, well, he can't be any bigger of a problem than a bear or lion, and God helped me kill them, so let's do it. Let's go take care of this guy. And so David follows God's will for him, God's direction for him. So Saul puts his armor on him, and if you read the story about Saul, it says that Saul was head and shoulders taller than anybody else in the country. And so now you got little David, big Saul, and Saul put his armor on David. And I remember that. Still, for whatever reason, I grew up remembering the King James Version of the Bible. That's what I grew up on. That's the churches that we talked about. And so I remember it said that David essayeth. And that doesn't mean he tried to say something. It meant David tried to move. David tried to move with all the armor on, and he couldn't. And so he kind of took Saul's armor off and said, hey, thanks, but I think God's got this. I've got a sling, and we're going to pick up some stones, and we're going to get this taken care of. And so he does. You remember the story, right? He picks up 5 stones, and he begins running. And I always hear people say, well, if you really trusted God, he only needed 1 stone. I agree with you. I think he trusted God so much that he took 5, because there was Goliath, and Goliath had 4 giant relatives. I think David was optimistic. Like, I'm taking him and whoever's next. Like your brother, your mama, whoever. Just bring them. I'm taking everybody. And so that's how that goes. But here's the thing. After David killed Goliath, he became an overnight sensation in the nation of Israel. Matter of fact, everyone loved David, and they began singing songs about David. Matter of fact, Samuel tells us some of the lyrics to one of those songs. Here's some of the lyrics to one of the songs they wrote and sang for David. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And the very next verse begins this way. This made Saul very angry. You think? Yeah, here's a king that was strong and powerful, and here's this little kid that's getting all the attention, and he's getting the songs written and sung for him. To the point, Saul became so angry, to the point where one day David's in the palace playing the harp. He was a musician as well. He's playing the harp. Saul became so angry that he picked up a javelin, he picked up a spear and threw it and tried to kill David and missed. But that was how angry Saul had become. Unsuccessful at killing David, Saul figures, hey, you know what? I'm just going to send him out to battle, and I hope they do him off, right? And here's Samuel's take, though, on Saul's decision to send David out for battle, and hopefully Saul hoped his demise. Here's what Samuel said happened. David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. Just powerful. Kind of cool. Here's Saul's response. When Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of. And we could probably, when you think of afraid of, think of threatened by, frustrated by, jealous of him. He became more jealous and threatened and frustrated and afraid of him. So Saul comes up with another plan, right? So here's Saul's plan. He's like, I got to get rid of this guy. I'm going to work it out to offer my daughter, Merab, as David's wife. And here's the thing how that would work, that David would have to somehow prove himself worthy to marry the king's daughter. And so Saul said, the way I'm going to have him prove that he's worthy is I'm going to send him out to battle again, the Philistines, and this time they'll kill him and I don't have to do it. And so Saul thinks, hey, best of both worlds, he dies and my hands are clean in all this. So what happens is instead of jumping at the opportunity to become Saul's son-in-law, David actually graciously and humbly tells Saul, I'm not worthy to marry your daughter. Like our family is nothing in this community, in this area. You're the king. I'm not even worthy. So here's the thing. This guy has had so much success. Things have gone so well. And you would think he would have this really big ego and this really big head. But he doesn't. He's a humble guy on top of it, which actually endears him even more to the people. Like, so if the people weren't a fan of David yet, they are now. Like, he just got offered the best position in the kingdom, and he refused it because he was humble. In the meantime, another one of King Saul's daughters, Michal, actually falls in love with David. Like, Merab wasn't really into David. She was kind of a pawn in the game a little bit here. But Michal really loved David, and David had fallen for her. And so Saul jumps at another chance to bring David into the family and somehow plot his death. He's like, okay, now I've got some leverage. They actually like each other. He's going to say yes to the marriage proposal this time. So David is pretty motivated to marry Michal. So Saul tells him, the bride price to marry my daughter is 100 dead Philistines. David's thinking, hey, I'm pretty motivated. I love this girl, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. And so David gathers up a few of his men, and they go out, and instead of 100 Philistines, they kill 200. They come back with incredibly motivated, kind of the bloody evidence of what they've done and everything. So David ends up marrying Michal, who loves David, but she refuses to be used and manipulated by her father, King Saul. That was Saul's end. He thought, well, I'll get them married, and then I'll use Michal to kind of work what I want in that life and that relationship and against David. So here's Samuel's summary with all of that. 1 Samuel chapter 18, it says, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michal loved him, Saul became even more threatened by, afraid of, jealous of him. And he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. So as Saul's anger grew and he became more and more frustrated, here's what was happening in David's life. Every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all of the rest of Saul's officers. So David's name became very famous. So once again, Saul's frustration, David's fame come to a head in Saul's palace again one day. And there again, David's in the palace and he's playing music, and Saul's like, hey, I missed you the first time. I'm not going to go 0 for 2. He picks up a spear and he throws it and misses David. David escapes. And this time, David kind of takes the hint and he takes off. And from that point forward, David becomes the most hunted and most hated enemy of King Saul. So David would escape to the countryside, and it's kind of like something right out of Robin Hood. He escapes to the countryside, and he gathers with him like a band of merry men, and actually some merry women too. They were kind of all together. And so they began to just kind of roam the countryside, but the one thing they had in common, they all hated Saul. David wasn't a fan of Saul, obviously, and these men actually despised him. They were political enemies of Saul, but they looked at David as their eventual king. And so David and these men become sort of an outlaw posse that Saul was determined to do away with. So here's the connection kind of to the idea of address the mess. David has a big mess on his hands. He's got a big mess on his hands, right? His father-in-law wants him dead, and he's bound and determined to make sure this happens. And the thing that's a little bit different maybe than from our messes is this wasn't David's fault. Like, this mess wasn't David's fault. But here's the thing we can all relate to. It was still a mess. And David was going to be pursued by Saul and some of Saul's soldiers, and he was going to be presented with the challenge and the temptation of making that mess messier. And so that's where we're going to pick up the story. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. Here's what it says. After Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, they were out on a campaign. He was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-Gedi. So they're out battling, they're heading back home. Some people that had been spying out the land come up to Saul and his troops and said, hey, I think we've spotted David in the wilderness with his men. I think we've got him cornered. That's kind of what that's talking about. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. So if you've ever seen pictures, or maybe some of you guys have even visited the Holy Land or the Middle East in that area, it's a lot of that area it's not just flat and arid. It's rocky and really hilly terrain, and there's mountains and caves and all kinds of things up in the hills and valleys below. And so that's what that's talking about. Like near the rocks of the wild goats, there's an area where there was a lot of crags and peaks and things like that. So it says, at the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. And we'll press pause here because this is actually one of the only places in the Bible that talks about using the bathroom. And I don't know why that's really important, but if you have a middle school boy at home, for some reason, maybe that's interesting. It's like bathroom humor. So Saul and his men are going along the road, and they're in the rocky part of the country, and they're searching for David, and they stop in order for Saul to take care of what he needs to take care of. And if you grew up in church, you kind of know where this goes, but look what this says. It says, but as it happened, David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. Think about that. So here's what was happening, right? So David and his men got wind of the fact that Saul and the troops were pursuing them. And so obviously they decided, hey, instead of trying to outrun them, we're going to go up in these caves and these hills, and we're going to hide out for a while. Let Saul and his troops pass by, and then we'll come back down and we'll go the other way. I have to believe that was kind of hey, that's the plan. I don't think we're going to outrun his troops on horses and everything else. Here's how we're going to do this. But what are the odds, right? What are the odds that the very cave that David and his men are hiding in, that's the cave Saul decides to use at that moment? And it's almost, if you think about it, it's almost as if God was delivering David's enemy into his hand. It's like, hey, because what would happen here is Saul, they stop the whole pursuit, and Saul kind of makes his way up all by himself up to a cave. You know, like what everybody just kind of sat and waited for Saul to do what Saul needed to do. And so kind of this amazing thing. It's almost as if Saul was the problem, it seems like God just offered David the solution. Like, Saul's the problem, here's how we're going to take care of the problem. Here's a solution. Matter of fact, that's exactly what David's men believed was happening. Look what it says. Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today the Lord is telling you. Anybody ever tell you that? I think I know what God's telling you. You should probably start to understand that for yourself a little bit. Don't always take the word of somebody else. Nonetheless, now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish. In other words, David, this is the day we've all been waiting for. This is the day that we've been talking about night in and night out as we sit around the campfires and we wonder, how long are we going to have to stay on the run? And how long are we going to have to hide? And how long are we have to live as fugitives? You know, this is the day. You know, David, this is amazing. So all of Saul's men just watched Saul walk into the cave by himself. And so this is amazing. When you walk out of the cave holding Saul's head, it's coronation time. They're going to recognize this is your moment. They're going to crown you as king, and they're going to usher in your kingdom. So this is the moment we've all been waiting for. You know, in a sense, can you imagine just kind of like the drama, right? Saul's in the cave. He's in the front of the cave. They're way back, farther in the cave. It's dark in there. They can see Saul. Saul can't see them, and they're like, man, this is it. This is the moment. This is the time. God has been telling us it's time to step out and do what we should be doing. So here's the thing. David kind of gets caught up in all the emotion of it. And you can't blame him. He's been on the run. He's been hunted. He can't stay in one place very long at all without being flushed from that place. And he's trying to stay in his country as best as he can, but he's hiding and ducking, and he kind of gets caught up in the moment a little bit. And David decides to do unto him what he intends to do unto me. And no one would blame him. No one would blame him. I mean, in a sense, we would understand. He would be justified. Everyone, you know, in a sense, you can almost imagine the conversation David's having in his mind. Everyone knows what Saul's been trying to do to me. I'm just going to do to him what he already planned to do to me. And in a sense, it's kind of like self-defense. You know, it's kind of, he's trying to understand and wrap his mind around this situation and this particular opportunity. So I want us to pause for just a moment here, and we'll get back to the story. Here's something that I think we have to understand. At the root of most messes is a breakdown in virtue. At the root of most messes is a breakdown in virtue. Virtue, think about what is virtue, right? Virtue is integrity. Virtue is honesty. Virtue is goodness. Virtue is self-control. Virtue is patience. You know, all those things, you know, Galatians 5 lays out the fruit of the Spirit. If you're little guys, you've been here on Wednesday nights especially, I think a lot of you have been studying through those, right? Love, patience, peace, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, all those things. That's virtue. But when you scratch beneath the surface of most of the messes, at least the messes we've made for sure, but if you scratch beneath the surface, underneath that is a failure in virtue. In other words, if we ignore virtue, we will eventually make a mess. If we ignore virtue, we will eventually make a mess. It's just a matter of time. It's sowing and reaping. It's cause and effect. It's just a matter of time. Think about this. Ignore virtue in your marriage, and you'll have a mess. Ignore virtue in your relationships, and you'll have a mess. Ignore virtue in your academic pursuits, you'll have a mess. Ignore virtue in your professional pursuits, ignore virtue in your eventually you will make a mess. And here's the thing we have to understand. You don't clean up a failure in virtue with another failure in virtue. Right? You don't add more water to your flood. You don't add more foam insulation to the foam insulation. It doesn't get better. Two wrongs don't make a right. Here's the problem, though. Every mess comes with some really bad options. And those bad options always involve a failure in virtue. And I don't know about anybody else, those tend to be the options we're tempted to take because they seem to promise a quick fix. You ever find that? It's like, man, there's going to be a failure. There's a failure in virtue. There's some bad options, but somehow, some way, they get presented, they get shown, they get, kind of exposed. We get exposed to those options, and they seem, at least on the surface, to be an answer to a problem. They seem to provide a quick fix to a mess. Think about that. Think about the times maybe you've walked down this path. I have. I'll just borrow more money. How many financial messes has that fixed? I'll just lie. I'll just cover up the evidence. I'll just ask a friend to vouch for me and tell them where I was when I really wasn't there doing what I said I was doing that I wasn't really doing. A failure in virtue never cleans up a mess caused by a failure in virtue. With every mess, there are some bad options which involve a failure in virtue, which was exactly what David was about to choose. Almost exactly. Look what it says. 1 Samuel 24, verse 4. So David crept forward. They're far back in the cave. Saul's at the end, at the front. The men are saying, hey, this is what we've all been waiting for. David's tired of running and dodging, and he's tired of living life on the run. And so David creeps forward. And think about this. David was a warrior. This was in David's wheelhouse. He could creep up behind Saul without Saul ever knowing he was there, and it would be one yank of the hair and one slash, and all of David's problems are done, right? They're all fixed. The mess is now cleaned up. And as David is creeping up on Saul, something dawns on him. And I don't know what he said exactly in his own mind or in his heart, but I have to believe it's something along the lines of, I'm about to make my mess messier. I'm about to make a mess messier. I'm about to murder the king. I'm about to take the life of God's anointed. I'm about to kill my wife's dad. I'm about to kill my kid's granddad. What in the world am I thinking? I think he had that moment. If I murder the king, this will be my story forever. And here is where we get trapped. Just think about this for a second. And you guys respond as you want to. Would David have been justified? Would David have been justified in killing Saul? In pretty much everyone's eyes, the answer was yes. Like they knew Saul was kind of crazy, and he was angry, and it caused him to be so violent. And I mean, so in a sense, would David have been justified in killing the king? In everyone else's eyes, yes. Think about this one. Is this what everyone expected him to do? Matter of fact, it's what his men were telling him he should do. But here's the best question, the better question. Would it have been the virtuous thing to do? Absolutely not. David was about to add a part to his story that he would be embarrassed to tell the rest of his life. Think about that. Think about the conversation that David would have to engage in with his children. When his children said, Dad, tell us again, how did you become king? Well, kids, one day we were hiding out in the cave, and your granddad, King Saul, came to whatever they call that in 1000 BC to do what he needed to do. And my eyes had already adjusted to the dark, but his hadn't, so I kind of crept up behind him. He never heard me, and I killed him, and that's how I became king. And can you imagine the kid's response? Dad, that's brave, maybe? Is that? Or maybe the conversation he'd have with his wife. So David, tell me again, what happened to my dad? Well, hon, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what happened to him. We were kind of wandering around, and we stumbled into a cave, and there he was. He was dead. I'm not really sure what happened to him. David was about to make a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. And here's the thing we have to understand. Even though it was justified, even though it's what everyone expected, even though it is arguably what Saul deserved, and that's our dilemma. That's our tension. Because every mess comes with some really bad options. So David crept forward, and instead of killing Saul, he cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. So he creeps up behind Saul, and instead of attacking Saul, he grabs the robe that Saul had laid aside, and he cuts off a piece of the bottom of the robe, and then he creeps back into the cave, into the darkness. And his men are seeing this, and I have to imagine his men are like, what is going on? What is happening here? And here's what it says, as if that wasn't strange enough. It says David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. Like, not only was he not going to kill him, he felt bad that he cut some clothing off from him. Matter of fact, here's what he says. David says to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to my Lord and King. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one." And we're like, well, you didn't attack the Lord's anointed one. And that culture, yes, he did. Because if you touched anything and attacked anything that the king owned, it's like an attack on the king. Which is kind of interesting when you think about our relationship with our Heavenly Father and our King. That when we're persecuted, you know what God says? Don't worry about it. They're really persecuting me. It's against me. You're mine, and when people are persecuting you for my name's sake, they're persecuting me. But that was the way it worked. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. In a sense, David says, hey guys, I almost forgot that God put him in place, and it's not my job to replace what God has put in place. And in a sense, David says, I don't want to become king by murdering the king. So when David's men heard this, and I know we're filling in the blanks here, they basically said, hey, if you have an issue killing him, we don't. We are willing to do what you're unwilling to do. Matter of fact, we're glad to do what you're not willing to do. And so it says this, so David restrained his men. He did not let them kill Saul. Talk about influence. David had about 400 people that he restrained. I don't think that meant physically. I think he was able to speak to them in such a way that they were like, okay, I see your point. So if you think this story is good, listen to what happens next, right? So kind of a quick recap. Saul and his troops chasing David, his men through the desert. They stop so Saul can use the restroom. They move up there. They see him. They decide, hey, we're going to do to him before he does to us. David decides in the middle of this, that's not how it's going to go. And so he cuts off the hem of Saul's robe. And as far as Saul was concerned, nothing had happened. He leaves the cave, and he walks back down, and he gets on his mule because Saul rode a mule, and his men all kind of saddle up, and they're heading off. And it's just as they're getting ready to head off, David appears at the mouth of the cave with a piece of the robe that he cut off of Saul, and it's like, hey, hello. And here's what he says, right? It says that David came out and shouted after him. And so here's the thing you have to almost think about, though. All of Saul's men see this. All of Saul's men stop and go, David just walked out of the cave that our king was in, and all of a sudden I think they connect the dots and realize what had just not happened. I think they were wise enough to understand that could have been the end of Saul just now, and it's not. They all understand what had just not happened. And here's a part of what David said that Samuel recorded for us. For the Lord placed you at my mercy back there, Saul, in the cave. Some of my men told me to kill you, but I spared you. In other words, I did for you what no one else would have done for you in my place. I spared your life. David goes on. For I said, I will never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed one. You may not be acting like the Lord's anointed one. You may be a sorry example of the Lord's anointed one, but it's not my job to replace what God has put in place. And then David says something, I don't know about you guys, it just gripped me as I was reading through this text. David says this, "May the Lord judge between us." Saul, I'm not your judge. I'm going to leave that up to God. I'm not your judge. I'm going to let God take care of that. And then he goes on, perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you're trying to do to me, but I will never harm you. In a sense, Saul, I'm just going to let God take care of this. I'm going to leave this in God's hands, but I refuse to make my mess messier. I'm opting for virtue over vengeance. I'm going to choose the right thing over the easy thing. So what could Saul say, right? What can he say to that? Here's part of Saul's response. And Saul said to David, "You are a better man than I am, for you have repaid me good for evil. And now I realize that you are surely going to be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will flourish under your rule," which it did. And 7 chapters later, a random Philistine arrow pierces the armor of Saul, and he ultimately dies, and David becomes the king of Israel. Here's what I want us to make sure we don't miss today. Every mess comes with some bad options. And if we choose those options, it will only make our mess messier. And here's the thing, whether you want to believe this or not, there's some of you sitting in this room that are old enough, experienced enough to understand this and I think have experienced this. But here's a reality in life that I think has the potential to help all of us. Eventually, the mess that you are currently experiencing will be reduced to 1 or 2 sentences. And I know that's hard for you to believe because right now you're saying, you know what, I'm in a mess. This is the most challenging, the most difficult, the most heart-wrenching and heartbreaking season of my life. And I want you to know, eventually, that will be reduced to 1 or 2 sentences. 5 years ago, I went through a terrible divorce. 1 sentence. 4 years ago, we had to declare bankruptcy. 1 sentence. 2 years ago, I had to drop out of school because my grades were bad. 1 sentence. 6 months ago, I got arrested. 1 sentence. And I know in the middle of our messes, it doesn't seem like we will ever get a way out of it. We'll never find a way out of it. But I want to encourage you to understand that that mess will eventually be reduced down to 1 or 2 sentences. All of these life messes eventually get reduced to 1 or 2 sentences. So here's the thing. The real story isn't the mess. The real story isn't the mess because Jesus even said, in this world you will have tribulation. In this world you will have messes. So the real story isn't the mess. The real story is our response to the mess. That's the real story. The mess is the mess, and you can't undo the mess, right? You can't unscramble eggs. You can't unlive history. It's happened. But our response to the mess is what tells and what writes the rest of the story of our lives. The real story is your response to the mess. Because your response to the mess becomes a permanent part of your life story. So this brings us to the question we have to ask, right? And so somewhere between his friends and King Saul, this thought hits David. What story do I want to tell? When they ask me, David, how did you become king? What story do I want to tell? When people hear that you went through whatever you're going through, when people hear you went through that messy divorce, or they hear you went through that bankruptcy, or they hear you went through that difficult season of life, what story do you want to be able to tell coming out of that? What story do you want to be able to share coming out of the mess? Understanding that the decisions you're making in the middle of your mess right now can make the mess messier. And it can become a permanent part of your story. Maybe you had to drop out of school or you failed out of school. What option did you choose after that? Maybe you hit some really bad trouble. What option did you choose after the trouble? Let me ask it this way. Which of your options do you want as a permanent part of your story? And I think I know the answer. The virtuous one. You want the option that doesn't have a bunch of remorse and regret attached to it. You know, I faced her and I told her the truth. I turned myself in. I asked them exactly how much I owed them, and I promised if it took the rest of my life, I would pay them back. We cut up our credit cards. I went to the dean of the school and begged them that if they'd give me one more chance, I would study harder than I've ever studied before. I decided to honor God and my spouse in my marriage. I decided to honor God and follow Jesus in my dating relationship. Which of your options do you want as a permanent part of your story? Because the real story isn't our mess. All of us have messes. The real story is how will you address your mess. So as we wrap up today, let me encourage you. Let me give you a couple of takeaways. You know, it's like, okay, what do I do with this? And how does, you know, what are the handles I can grab a hold of thinking about this and moving forward? So here's a couple of takeaways. When thinking about the options you have to choose from in the middle of your mess, don't choose an option that makes you a liar for life. Do you understand what I mean by that? That when you get asked, so what happened when she confronted you? And don't choose the option that causes you to make up stories and spin it and twist it to somehow shine light more favorably on you, even though what you chose wasn't favorable. After the bankruptcy, what did you do? Made up story, made up story, made up story. After you got caught, what did you do? Made up story, made up story, made up story. Don't choose an option that makes you a liar or a hypocrite for life. Here's another takeaway. Don't use someone else's bad behavior as an excuse to behave badly. That was David's dilemma. David had every reason in the world to behave badly based on Saul's bad behavior, right? He had every reason in the world. Saul is hunting me. He's trying to kill me. I have every reason in the world to behave badly based on Saul's bad behavior. And here's why this is important. Some of you are dealing with difficult circumstances and difficult people, and it's going to be really, really easy to choose the option that allows you to behave badly based on their bad behavior. But let me just share with you, and I'm speaking from total experience. I'm not trying to do super spiritual dude on you. I'm just telling you, just from personal life experience, don't choose that route because it makes the mess messier. No matter how justified you felt in your bad behavior, no matter how many reasons you believe you had to support your bad behavior, don't choose an option that uses their bad behavior as an excuse for bad behavior. Just don't do it. God wants to save us from that. He really does. He calls us to walk a higher road, a better road than that. He's called us to choose the options that are often and usually more difficult, but are much more rewarding. Don't use someone else's bad behavior as an excuse to behave badly. That's not the story you want to tell. You don't want to tell that story 10 years down the road with a bunch of regret attached to it. So I know when it comes to our messes, right, we all want a quick fix, right? One more loan, one more lie. He lied about me, she ruined my reputation, so I'm going to get him back and I'm going to even the score. But before you run down that path, think about the story you have the opportunity to tell. Think about that. David, how did you become king? I did the right thing, even though it was the difficult thing. I chose virtue over vengeance. I opted for virtue over expediency. I trusted my Heavenly Father to work all things together for good and for His glory. This is why Jesus doesn't just fix our messes. It's why He calls us and asks us to follow Him out of our messes. Because here's the thing, if we follow Him, He promised to walk us around some really bad options that only result in messier messes. He promises if we'll follow Him, He'll walk us around those landmines, those bad options that sit out there. And one day when we look back, we won't have to lie or be a hypocrite or somehow look back and say, well, because of what they did, that's why I did what I did. Instead, we can follow Jesus and watch him turn messes into a powerful message. We can watch him transform our trials and our difficulties into triumphs because that's who he is and that's what he does. But he can only do it if we follow him. So how are you going to address your mess? My prayer, my hope for all of us is that we'll choose the options that don't make the messes messier. That as difficult as it is often to choose the right thing, that God will give us the strength. We'll be surrounded by people that encourage us to keep choosing the right thing. Let me pray for you, and then we're going to sing, and we'll get you out of here. Heavenly Father, we just, God, I wish I could sit up here and claim that my life is so well put together and I have no messes. But that's not true. And it's not true, I don't think, for any of us today. There's all messy parts of our lives, and maybe messy parts of our marriages, and messy parts of our relationships and our finances, God, and if we were really super honest, oftentimes those messes are our fault. We like to blame other people. We like to lay the blame on others and other circumstances and situations. But God, if we were really, really honest with you and with ourselves, we'd admit that a lot of those messes, at the root of those messes, was a failure in virtue, and that was my fault. God, would you help us understand that your desire for us is not to free us from every mess, but to help us walk out of those messes without making them messier. That in the process we would learn and we would grow and we would come to know you even greater as you walk us through these difficult things and these challenging things. That we would understand the truths of your word and the principles that are in there, that we would start to apply those. God, I think we all need more of that. God, most significantly is the fact that we are all sinners. We are all born messes. And you loved us enough to step into our mess and to deliver us from it if we only believe. And that's the only criteria you placed on us walking out of the mess of sin. The only criteria you hold up for us is not how well we behave. It's not whether or not we were baptized. The only criteria, you told us in John 3:16 that God loved the world so much that he sent his son into this world, that if we just believe, we would not perish, but have everlasting and eternal life. God, you offered us the opportunity to step out of the greatest mess we'll ever step in, and that's the fact that we are sinners separated from you, and you have offered us the opportunity to have a relationship through what Jesus did so that we can have eternal life in you and through your Son. God, help us understand that. As messy as our lives is, that's a choice this morning. If we're here and we don't know Christ, that's a choice we can take this very moment that will begin to walk us out of our mess. I pray for somebody here today that hasn't done it, that today would be that day they go, you know what, my life's a mess. Or maybe on the other side of it, maybe it's somebody that's like, you know what, my life's really good. I don't need anything. I really don't need God. Would you, God, with your Spirit, would you press upon them the fact that no one is ultimately that good that they don't need God? That at the end of their life, it's not going to be a measure of their goodness. It's going to be a measure of what they did with their belief in Jesus. Would you help them understand that it's not about how well your life is packaged. It's about the fact that Jesus went to a cross and we needed him to rescue us from our sin and to now give us an opportunity to follow him the rest of our lives. God, help us hear whatever it is we need to hear. Let it land where it needs to land in our lives. And then more than anything, give us the courage to live it out. And we just pray this in Christ's name. Amen.